I never thought one man could change the entire temperature of a company in less than a week, but that was before I met Ethan Cross. My name is Clara Jennings. I'm 38 years old, born and raised in a small town outside of Spokane, Washington, but for the past 14 years I have called Denver my home. I've worked at TechSpire Solutions for almost as long, rising quietly through the ranks from junior developer to senior systems architect. I was never flashy, never political, but I was dependable. I built tools that worked. I kept my promises, and I knew every single line of code that ran through our security software. And I thought that kind of loyalty meant something. Well, as it turns out, loyalty is nothing when a man like Ethan walks in with his tailored suits, his perfect smile, and a playbook designed to strip everything and everyone down to whatever he can control. When the board announced they had hired him as our new chief executive officer, there were polite smiles in the conference room and a round of applause that sounded more forced than sincere. His reputation had traveled ahead of him. Known he was the kind of turnaround leader companies brought in when they wanted cuts, fast results, and no questions asked. I told myself I would keep my head down and just do my job. But something about the way he looked at me that first day made my stomach tighten. He introduced himself with a firm handshake and a pause, as if memorizing my face for later. I had no idea at the time how quickly that moment would come back to me. By the second week, he had already reshuffled 2 departments, removed 3 managers, and replaced them with people from his old network. Morale was dropping, whispers were rising, and the air in the office felt colder, tighter. Then came the company-wide town hall. Ethan stood at the front of the room, immaculate in a navy suit that looked like it had been cut from silk. He paced slowly, like a man who owned every eye in the room. His voice was smooth, confident, but there was an edge beneath it that made you lean in and brace at the same time. He talked about alignment, streamlining, and maximizing intellectual assets. Then, without breaking his stride, he said it. From now on, everything you create here belongs to TechSpire. No exceptions. There was a pause, deliberate, like he wanted the words to sink deep. My chest tightened. I felt the eyes of my colleagues darting around the room, confusion flickering across their faces. He had just erased years of unspoken respect between this company and the people who built it. And then, just for a moment, his gaze locked on mine. Not on the row, not on the team. On me. It was not curiosity. It was recognition. No, as if he already knew exactly what I had built and exactly how badly he wanted it. My lips stayed pressed together, but inside, something stirred. It was not just anger. It was the sharp awareness that this man was going to come for me, and when he did, he would not play fair. I thought of the countless nights I had spent at my kitchen table, working on my own designs, code I had paid for and developed entirely on my own time, with my own resources. Code that just happened to sit at the very heart of the product TechSpire had been selling for years. That work was mine, and mine alone. But I knew men like Ethan. They saw ownership as a technicality, not a truth. When the meeting ended, people filed out in low murmurs. Some tried to brush it off as corporate posturing, others looked pale and shaken. And I went back to my desk, my mind already racing through what I knew, what I had documented, and what I would need to protect. I'd always kept meticulous records. Dates, times, receipts, even video of my home workspace. Not because I expected trouble, but because I believed in leaving no gaps for doubt. Now, for the first time, I felt those records shift from habit to lifeline. Ethan passed by my desk on his way out. He stopped, leaned just slightly, and said, We will be talking soon. Clara. It was not a question, not even a polite statement. It was a promise, or maybe a warning. I watched him walk away, his back straight, his steps unhurried, as though he had already planned how this story would end. But I had a plan too. One, and if he thought I was just going to hand him what I had built, then Ethan Cross was about to find out exactly how dangerous it can be to underestimate someone who has spent years preparing for a fight they never wanted. But we'll finish without hesitation. That night, after the town hall, I sat at my dining room table with a cup of coffee gone cold, scrolling through an old folder on my personal laptop. And it was one of those folders you never think you will need until the day comes when it becomes the most important thing you own. The folder was labeled simply, Employment 2012. Inside were scanned copies of every contract, every amendment, every performance review I had ever signed with TechSpire Solutions. I remembered the day I negotiated my original offer like it was yesterday. I was 26. Green but determined, sitting across from a hiring manager who underestimated how closely I read fine print. Back then, I had insisted on adding my own sentence to the intellectual property section. Clause 14B. It was not long or fancy. Just one line that said, any intellectual property created outside of company hours, using personal resources, shall remain the sole property of the employee. It was not a demand I made out of arrogance. I made it because I had always been a creator. Even before TechSpire, I would spend nights and weekends tinkering with code, building prototypes, sketching software frameworks. It was my way of keeping my creativity alive outside the confines of corporate projects. In my mind, that line in the contract was just a safeguard, a way to protect my personal work from being swallowed by whatever company I happened to work for. Thus, no one pushed back on it at the time, probably because they never thought it would matter. But it mattered now. More than ever. Because for the past 5 years, I had been building something that went far beyond a side project. I had designed and perfected Vanguard Lock, an encryption framework unlike anything else on the market. I had built it on my own laptop, using servers I paid for out of my own pocket, in a home office that had never seen a cent of TechSpire's money. And yet, TechSpire had been using parts of it, through licensing agreements I had allowed, inside their flagship security platform. And the arrangement had always been beneficial. They got cutting-edge encryption, I got royalties, and my work stayed mine. But I could see Ethan's plan as clearly as if he had handed me his playbook. Strip me of ownership, fold Vanguard Lock completely into the company's assets, and never pay me another dime. The memory of his words, no exceptions, echoed in my head. He thought that was the end of the conversation. What he did not know was that Clause 14B was still in force. I had checked every single contract amendment over the years, and not one had removed it. Mate, the company had tried to bury me in new agreements and policy updates, but the legal backbone of my employment had never been severed. And if push came to shove, I had the records, the receipts, and the legal right to draw a line that Ethan would not be able to cross without tearing his own company apart. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the glow of my laptop screen. A normal person might have felt relief, maybe even a little smugness, at having this kind of hidden advantage. But I felt something else. Resolve. This was no longer about protecting a clause in a contract. This was about protecting years of my life, nights of work no one else had seen, and the principle that a person's creation is not just a piece of paper to be traded or stolen. Ethan might have walked into TechSpire thinking he could own everything under its roof. But Vanguard Lock was not under his roof. It was under mine. And that was going to be the one thing he would never see coming. As the clock pushed past midnight, I closed the folder and shut down my laptop. I knew Ethan would make his move soon. Men like him never delayed when they saw an opportunity. But the difference between us was simple. He saw this as a game of acquisition. I saw it as a line in the sand. And I was ready to make sure that when the day came, he would find out just how dangerous it is to underestimate the person who wrote the rules you are trying to break. In the days after that town hall, I moved like nothing had changed. I kept my head down, answered emails, attended project meetings, and nodded politely when Ethan strolled through the office with that self-satisfied smile. But beneath the calm surface, I was tightening every screw in the walls I had built around Vanguard Lock. People like Ethan thrive when their target is unprepared, and I refused to give him that satisfaction. Every lunch break, every evening after work, I quietly strengthened my defenses. I reviewed the licensing agreements between myself and TechSpire, ensuring every clause was crystal clear. I pulled backups of my source code from the safe deposit box and stored duplicates in encrypted drives only I could access. Even the encryption protecting those drives was something only I knew how to break. Layers inside layers, designed to frustrate anyone who tried to pry into what was mine. I had been meticulous from the start. My development logs for Vanguard Lock dated back to the first line of code I ever wrote for it. Each log had timestamps, IP addresses from my home network, and even short video clips showing my screen while I worked. Proof that every keystroke happened outside TechSpire's walls. Every receipt from my personal servers, every licensing renewal, every email between myself and vendors was cataloged in folders so organized that my attorney, Margaret, once joked I should run a museum for obsessive creators. Some people keep a diary for their personal lives. I kept one for my intellectual property, and it was a fortress. I also started to watch Ethan more closely. And he was calculated in everything. How he phrased questions in meetings, how he hinted at integrating all projects under one central ownership model. That was his way of laying the groundwork, planting the idea that every innovation here belonged to him, to TechSpire, by default. I could see him testing boundaries, seeing who would push back and who would stay silent. Most stayed silent. I did not blame them. Not everyone had the luxury of a clause like mine. But I could not ignore the way his gaze always lingered a little longer when my name or my project came up in conversation. And the truth was, I had been preparing for someone like Ethan long before he even knew my name. It is not paranoia if you have seen enough people lose what they created because they trusted the wrong leader. I'd watched colleagues in other companies watch their patents slip into corporate ownership with nothing more than a thank you for your contribution in return. I swore that would never be me. So when Ethan made his move, and I knew he would not be facing an unarmed employee clinging to scraps. So he would be walking straight into a fight with someone who had been quietly building her case for years. One evening, as the last of the office lights dimmed, I walked past the glass wall of the CEO's office. Ethan was inside, leaning back in his chair, speaking low into the phone with a smile that never reached his eyes. I could not hear the words, but I knew the type. It was the smile of a man who thought he had already won. I kept walking, my own expression calm, my footsteps unhurried. He could think what he wanted. Let him believe the trap was set in my direction. The truth was, I was the one setting it. And when the moment came to spring it, the only thing he would own was the mistake of thinking I would hand him what I had built without a fight. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where nothing feels particularly remarkable until it suddenly does. I just returned from a project review meeting when I saw the message pop up on my screen. Please report to the CEO's office immediately. There was no reason, No explanation. Just that. Now, my first instinct was to gather my notes, but something in the brevity of that message made me leave them behind. By the time I reached Ethan's office, I saw that the blinds were drawn. That alone was unusual. He liked being on display, like a king behind glass. Today, the kingdom was closed off. Inside, 2 people were already seated. Rita Morales, our HR director, 55, with a face that could deliver bad news without blinking, and another man I did not recognize. Later, I would learn he was from the company's legal department. On the table in front of them sat a neat stack of papers clipped together with a silver binder clip. Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, and greeted me with a smile so polite it bordered on theatrical. "Clara, please, have a seat," he said. The next few minutes unfolded like a scene I had already rehearsed in my mind. Rita took the lead, her tone practiced and neutral. "Due to ongoing restructuring, your position is being eliminated effective immediately. This packet contains your severance agreement and details regarding your transition." I flipped the packet open. The first page read like standard legalese, but by the third page, I found it. A paragraph buried deep in the fine print. It stated that, in exchange for my severance, I would irrevocably transfer to Techspire Solutions all rights, title, and interest in any and all intellectual property, whether created during or outside the scope of employment, related to the company's products or services. I felt the heat rise in my chest. This was it. The grab. Well, the very thing I had been expecting since the day Ethan locked eyes with me at that town hall. He wanted Vanguard lock, and he wanted it quietly. Wrapped in a severance check that would look generous enough to make me sign without reading too closely. He must have thought I would be too stunned, too concerned about losing my job, to notice the theft hiding in plain sight. I looked up from the packet. "This seems broader than what we have discussed before," I said evenly. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his tone just shy of condescending. It is standard procedure, Clara. We like to have all loose ends tied up cleanly. This way, there are no disputes down the road." His eyes stayed locked on mine, and I could see the confidence there, the belief that he was already holding the winning card. I closed the packet and set it neatly back on the table. "I will need to review this before signing anything," I replied, my voice calm, almost pleasant. Ethan's smile twitched, just barely. "Of course," he said, but I could hear the faint edge in his tone. This was not the reaction he had been expecting. He wanted a quick signature and a quiet exit. What he got instead was a door opening to something he could not yet see. As I walked out of his office, the packet in hand, I felt the strange stillness that comes before a storm you have been watching on the horizon for days. This was no longer theoretical. He had made his move. And now it was my turn. The difference was, I had been preparing for this match long before he ever knew there was a game to play. When I reached my desk, I slid the packet into my bag without a word. By the time I left the building, I already knew my next stop would be Margaret Hale's office. Ethan thought this was the beginning of my end. He had no idea it was the first step toward his. The next morning, I sat across from Margaret Hale, my attorney of nearly 8 years. Margaret was 52, sharp-eyed, and the kind of woman who could read a 40-page contract in 20 minutes and still have time to make notes in the margins. Her office smelled faintly of lemon polish and coffee, and the wall behind her desk was lined with framed degrees, professional awards, and a few photographs of her golden retriever, Max. And she had always been my go-to for licensing negotiations, the one person I trusted to guard Vanguard lock with the same ferocity I did. When I walked in carrying the severance packet, She gave me a look that said she already knew this was going to be one of those meetings. I slid the papers across her desk without saying a word. When she opened them, her eyes scanning in short, precise movements. When she reached the buried clause, she let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Well, they're not even trying to be subtle, are they?" she said, flipping the page back and forth as though checking if she had read it correctly. "This is a full intellectual property transfer. And they are trying to slip it in under severance? Amateur hour." She leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from irritation to amusement. They really have no idea who they are dealing with. She reached for her keyboard and pulled up a digital copy of my original employment contract, one she had kept since the day I signed it. "Clause 14B, she said, pointing to the screen. "Still here. Still valid. And, more importantly, never superseded. Every amendment they had you sign over the years kept the original IP protections intact. This," she tapped the severance packet, "is nothing more than wishful thinking on their part. If you had signed this, they would have a clean path to take Vanguard Lock without paying a cent." "Yes, but they are about to find out they cannot retroactively erase your ownership just because it is convenient for them." Margaret began drafting a letter right then and there, her fingers moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to dismantle an opponent. And the letter was addressed directly to TechSpire's board of directors and their in-house counsel, bypassing Ethan entirely. It cited Clause 14B, listed the dates and proof of my independent development, and included a formal demand. Remove all instances of my proprietary code from TechSpire products within 14 days or face immediate legal action. Then she added a final paragraph stating that any further attempt to claim my work without consent would result in a licensing fee triple the industry standard, along with full auditing rights. When she was done, Margaret looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "Clara, I hope you are ready for this. Once this letter lands, it will not just be Ethan coming after you. The entire board is going to realize he has put them in a very expensive corner." I felt the knot in my chest loosen just a little. "I have been ready for years," I told her. And it was true. Every log, every receipt, every backup copy. I had not collected them out of paranoia. I had collected them because I knew one day someone would try to take what was mine. Now that the day had come, I was not going to give an inch. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that made you feel like the storm was on your side. "Then let us make sure they understand exactly what they have walked into." She hit print, slid the letter into a heavy cream envelope, and sealed it with a deliberate press of her hand. That sound, the soft rip of adhesive catching, was the moment I knew Ethan Cross had just gone from a man with a plan to a man with a problem. And I was about to make sure it was one he could not solve. By the following Monday, Margaret's letter had been delivered. I knew it had landed when my phone lit up at 8:14 a.m. with 3 missed calls from numbers I did not recognize, followed by a curt email from TechSpire's in-house counsel requesting an urgent meeting to clarify misunderstandings. There was no misunderstanding. They had tried to take what was mine, and now they were standing on a trapdoor of their own making. Margaret advised me not to respond directly, so I did not. The letter had said everything that needed saying. Inside that envelope was more than a legal threat. It was a ticking clock. 14 days to remove every fragment of Vanguard Lock from their products, or we would file for an injunction that would freeze distribution entirely. That meant pulling CipherGate, TechSpire's flagship security platform, off the market. Without my encryption core, CipherGate was nothing more than an empty shell, a glossy interface with no lock behind the door. And the moment it was disabled, their entire security infrastructure would collapse like a sandcastle under a wave. I pictured Ethan getting that news from his legal team. I imagined the flash of anger, the denial, the scramble to find a loophole that did not exist. Men like him are used to cornering others, not being cornered themselves. Once done, but the beauty of this moment was that I had not needed to invent anything new or twist the truth. I had simply shown them the rules they had agreed to long ago and reminded them that I still held the pen. By midweek, the ripples had already started. One of TechSpire's largest government clients froze a pending contract worth millions, citing pending intellectual property disputes. A European licensing partner demanded written confirmation that all software components were free from legal encumbrance. They were not. And now everyone knew it. Ethan could try to bluff his way through meetings, but those who understood the stakes knew this was a fault line that could crack the entire company in two. I did not call anyone at TechSpire. I did not argue my case in person. Silence was my weapon, and the letter was my voice. Margaret handled every response, every counterargument, every attempt to negotiate in their favor. The answer was always the same: remove my code or pay the licensing fee. Triple the standard rate, with full auditing rights, payable in advance. No half measures, no handshake deals, no whispered promises. Late one evening, I sat in my home office and looked at my private server dashboard. Vanguard Lock was still humming along in perfect order, untouched by their reach. I could see every system in TechSpire's network that was tethered to my encryption key. It was like looking at a map of their dependency, the quiet truth that they had built their crown jewel on, ground they did not own. And all I had to do to take it back was flip one switch. Ethan had wanted to make me a liability to be removed. Instead, I had made myself the one asset they could not operate without. And the difference between us was simple. He thought power was about taking control. I knew power was about never needing to take it back, because you never let it go in the first place. Now, it did not take long for the first fracture to appear. 4 days after Margaret's letter hit the board's desks, I got a discreet message from a former colleague in sales. It was short and to the point. 3 licensing deals are on hold. Clients are nervous. You did something, did you not? I did not answer, but I smiled. Not because I wanted to watch TechSpire stumble, but because I knew they had built their empire on my work and never thought they would have to pay the toll. Now that toll was coming due. Then by the end of the week, the rumors had spread beyond the company. Industry blogs were speculating about a major security flaw in Cyphergate, citing unnamed sources. The irony was that there was no flaw. Just the absence of something they did not own. Without Vanguard Lock's encryption core, Cyphergate could not meet the compliance requirements for several high-value contracts. Government agencies withdrew bids. Corporate clients delayed renewals. While a high-profile tech conference quietly removed TechSpire from its keynote lineup. On paper, Ethan still had his job. In reality, the floor was starting to give way beneath him. I could picture the meetings. The board huddled around a long, glossy table, Ethan at the head trying to explain how this had blindsided them, legal counsel shuffling papers to hide the fact that Margaret's letter had laid out the situation in unforgiving detail. The clause was valid. The evidence was airtight. They could not rewrite the past to make it disappear. Every day that passed without a resolution was another day their competitors edged forward and their reputation slipped further away. From my home office, I watched the slow unraveling through public channels and private whispers. The engineers were burning themselves out trying to code a replacement encryption framework, but I knew they could not match Vanguard Lock in 2 weeks, or 2 months for that matter. This was not a system you could replicate by copying its surface. It was a puzzle layered with logic that only I knew how to solve. Every piece was mine, documented and protected. Yeah, and with every failed attempt to replace it, they fell further behind. I did not gloat. I did not call old colleagues to stir the pot. That was Ethan's style. Showy, loud, making sure everyone saw the victory. Mine was quieter, cleaner. I had pulled the thread and simply watched as the fabric came apart. In my mind, I kept going back to that moment at the town hall when he had said, "No exceptions," and looked directly at me. He had spoken those words like a verdict. But now they were echoing back at him like a sentence. By the start of the second week, TechSpire's stock price had dipped noticeably. It was not a collapse. Yet. But the shift was enough to make investors nervous. Enough to make the board start asking the kind of questions CEOs dread. And somewhere in that building, I knew Ethan was starting to understand something important. He had not just picked a fight with an employee. He had picked a fight with the foundation his company was standing on. And foundations, once shaken, do not stop cracking. By the 13th day of the 14-day deadline, the cracks had widened into chasms. Clients were not just pausing contracts. They were pulling out entirely. 2 major partners announced they would be exploring alternative solutions to Cyphergate, which was corporate language for "we are leaving before the ship sinks." Inside TechSpire, panic was no longer whispered. It was visible. Departments were in open conflict, engineers blaming sales for overpromising, sales blaming leadership for hiding the truth, and leadership was Ethan. I heard from a friend in finance that the board had called an emergency meeting without Ethan present. That was never a good sign. In the corporate world, once your board starts meeting without you, you are no longer the one steering the ship. You are the iceberg they are trying to avoid. My friend said there was talk of rebuilding confidence and isolating liabilities, both phrases that translate directly to find a scapegoat fast. And when you are the CEO who promised exponential growth but delivered a legal disaster, you make an easy target. The official news came the next afternoon. I was sipping tea in my kitchen when a notification popped up on my phone. TechSpire Solutions announces leadership change. The press release was short, professional, and utterly cold. Ethan Cross was departing the company to pursue other opportunities. No thanks for his service. No list of accomplishments. Just gone. His seat was already filled by an interim CEO, someone the board could control while they tried to salvage what was left. I imagined the moment he was told, maybe in that same glass office where he had once smirked at me across the table. I wondered if he understood in that instant that it was not just a job he was losing. It was the illusion of control he had carried like armor. Why men like Ethan rarely believe they can be outmaneuvered until the trap closes and they realize they were walking into it all along. The irony was that my letter had never once mentioned his name. It was not about him. It was about my work, my rights, and the contract they had signed without thinking it would ever matter. But Ethan had tied himself to the outcome so tightly that when the rope snapped, he went with it. I did not celebrate his fall. I did not post cryptic quotes online or send messages through mutual contacts. But I did allow myself one quiet acknowledgement. That the man who told me there would be no exceptions had just discovered the exception that could end his career. The next morning, my attorney called to tell me the board was ready to talk. They knew they could not win in court. They knew replacing the encryption core was not going to happen overnight. And most importantly, they knew the only way forward was to make me an offer that was worth my time. The tables had turned completely. I was no longer the employee at risk. I was the only person who could decide whether TechSpire survived the year. And that was a position Ethan had never imagined I would hold. When the board finally reached out, they did not bother with polite introductions or small talk. One, the interim CEO, a measured man named Robert Hale, spoke first. His voice was calm, but every word carried the weight of urgency. Clara, we would like to resolve this matter without further disruption to our operations. Further disruption. That was their way of admitting the damage had already been done. Sure, I listened without interrupting as Robert explained that they wanted to license Vanguard Lock back into Cyphergate. They were prepared to pay. They just needed to know my price. I did not rush to answer. This was not about greed. It was about control. For years, I had watched executives like Ethan make decisions that stripped creators of their rights in the name of efficiency. I was not about to hand them my work without rewriting the rules they operated by. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice even, professional. If you want Vanguard Lock, you will license it on my terms. Triple the industry rate, paid annually in advance. I will maintain full auditing rights, and if there is a single breach of the agreement, the license is revoked immediately. No arbitration. No appeals. You breach, you lose access. Period. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause where you can almost hear the weight of the decision being measured. Robert cleared his throat. Those are strict conditions. I leaned back in my chair. They are fair conditions. Your product depends on my technology. I am offering you a way to keep it running. You decide how valuable that is. I left the silence hanging. Margaret, sitting beside me, gave a small nod. She knew as well as I did that they had no other option. By the end of the call, the board had agreed to every term. The contract was drafted that same week, reviewed by Margaret line by line, and signed without a single amendment. For the first time since Ethan's arrival, I felt the knot in my chest loosen completely. Vanguard Lock was still mine. Untouched, unclaimed. And now it was shielded by a legal agreement they could not afford to break. And the power had shifted, permanently. The day the payment cleared, I walked past TechSpire's headquarters on my way to lunch. Through the glass, I could see employees moving about, heads bent over screens, the usual hum of corporate life resuming. But I knew that under the surface, things had changed. They could run their systems, make their sales, and pitch their clients. But only because I allowed it. My terms were not just in the contract. They were now the foundation of their survival. Ethan had once believed that control meant owning everything. Won I had learned that true control meant owning the one thing they could not function without, and holding it so tightly that they had to treat you with the respect they once thought they could bypass. TechSpire was back in business, but it was on my leash, and I had no intention of ever letting go. 2 weeks after the new licensing agreement was signed, I sat in my home office on a quiet Friday morning, sipping coffee and watching the dashboard for Vanguard Lock on my private server. Every system that TechSpire depended on was humming along, tied directly to the encryption keys only I controlled. I hovered over the master switch for a moment, not because I planned to use it, but because I wanted to remind myself that I could. With one click, I could freeze every TechSpire product connected to my technology. That knowledge was not about temptation, and it was about ownership, the kind of ownership Ethan once thought he could erase with a single buried clause in a severance packet. That afternoon, I did something I'd been waiting for. Emo and I updated the splash screen that appeared whenever a TechSpire product loaded Vanguard Lock's encryption. The new message was short, simple, and impossible to miss. Licensed under Clara Jennings IP Holdings. All rights reserved. No flashing lights. No taunts. No hidden meaning. Just a quiet statement of fact that would greet every client, every partner, and every employee who opened the software. It was my way of stamping my name on what was mine, in plain sight, for as long as they used it. I never heard from Ethan again. I imagine he went on to another company, another boardroom, maybe another turnaround that looked more like a teardown. But in my mind, his part in my story ended the moment he lost the one thing he came for. This had never been about revenge in the way people expect. There was no shouting match, no dramatic confrontation in the middle of the office. My victory came in the form of silence, preparation, and patience. I let him believe he was holding all the cards until the moment I showed him the one he could never beat. What happened with TechSpire taught me something I will never forget. Power is not about what you take from someone else. It is about what you refuse to give away. For years, I had safeguarded my work because it mattered to me, not because I thought someone would try to steal it. That preparation was the difference between walking away empty-handed and standing my ground with everything intact. Now, when I pass TechSpire's building, I do not feel bitterness. I feel clarity. Inside those walls, they still run my code, still rely on the technology they once tried to claim as their own. Yeah, and every time they see my name on that splash screen, it is a reminder. Not just to them, but to me, that I was never powerless. I was simply waiting for the right moment to prove it. Ethan once told me there would be no exceptions. He was wrong. I was the exception, and I always will be.